So the big issue right now is obviously Cuba. U.S. media is harping away on the fact that there are protests against the government. Protests are calling for more food and more medical supplies. Perfectly reasonable demands. Now, the part that's dishonest is that very few people in the West are talking about, whether it's the media or the politicians, are talking about the U.S. embargo. But the U.S. embargo is directly leading to these shortages. So if we really cared about the people of Cuba, we would lift the embargo. But instead, what we're doing is we're pretending like the embargo is irrelevant, and we're blaming the Cuban government alone. And so what we want is for the Cuban government to get overthrown and for, us to get back involved and have another puppet state and have a U.S. dictator in there to, serve our interests. So the discussion in the media has been insane. Most of the comments from politicians have been insane. Hardly anybody's talking about the embargo. And it's dishonest and it's disingenuous. And the fact that people are getting such a skewed picture of what's going on is infuriating. Well, thankfully, you have new and independent media stepping up to fill the gap here. Now, admittedly, listen, I'm biased. Krystal Ball is obviously my co-host for Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. And so, I tend to like her work all the time, but this one was particularly great in my opinion. So she did a segment on her show Breaking Points with Sagar where she absolutely obliterated the neocon Cuba regime change cheerleaders.
Well, as protests broke out across Cuba, of course, American politicians and American media were quick to jump into the fray, walking right up to that endorsing regime change line and sometimes jumping right on in.
It's now almost 10 p.m. Eastern time. It's now been over 12 hours since over 32 cities in Cuba, brave people have taken to the streets to protest against the communist, Marxist, evil tyranny. And so far, not a word, not a statement from Joe Biden, from the vice president, from the White House, not a word. What is it so hard? Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard? Why are they so uncomfortable coming forward and just condemning this evil socialist Marxist regime?
Well, first of all, I think America needs to understand that this impacts America. The Cuban dictatorship is, a drug trafficking dictatorship. They sponsor terrorism, and they have also exported communism throughout the hemisphere and throughout the world. So it affects U.S. interests, and that's something that I think sometimes is not emphasized enough of how this affects U.S. national security policy. And I think the U.S. has to understand that these kinds of regimes that are enslaving not just Cubans, but Nicaraguans and Venezuelans, and are involved in a variety of different places throughout the world, impact our sovereignty and our security. And so I think the U.S. has a vested interest and a right to intervene on behalf of the Cuban people, but also on behalf of the United States.
If we could find a way to add some freedom and democracy in Cuba and overthrow the last remnants of communism and the Castros, this would have a ripple positive effect for the region.
So in addition, Senator Menendez, the powerful chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, tells us for decades Cuba's dictatorship has used violence and repression to silence its people rather than permit the free exercise of democracy and their basic social rights. This must end, going on to promise to use the force of his office to make sure the U.S. stands in solidarity with the people of Cuba. Florida Congresswoman and Senate hopeful Val Demings wrote in a rather unsettling tweet that America stands for freedom. We must stand with the peaceful demonstrators in Cuba. The White House must move swiftly. Move swiftly to do what exactly? Now, few come out and say what that something we must do immediately is, but history provides a whole lot of bad examples of ways that the U.S. helps to topple regimes and usher in quote-unquote democracy. And last but not least, the guy running the Army and the CIA, that'd be Joe Biden, had this to say: "We stand with the Cuban people and their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by Cuba's authoritarian regime." All right, I have a few things to say to all of this. First of all, for all of those loudly screaming that we must do something to support the Cuban people, I completely agree. We should do the something that is directly in our power and purview, which is to immediately remove the brutal sanctions that have fueled shortages and are especially murders during a pandemic. We could also do something by lifting vaccine patent protections and helping supply vaccines to Cuba and everywhere else in the world, by the way. After all, It sure does take a lot of nerve for these people to pretend to rend their garments in agony over the plight of the Cuban people when they're all directly complicit in the suffering of that nation. And oh, by the way, it is true, as some have pointed out, that the Cuban government uses the American sanctions to distract from any of their own domestic failings and repressive actions. So don't give them the excuse. Colombians have been protesting the neoliberal policies of their right-wing government for months and were met with government-sponsored violence. But I didn't hear too much about that from our newfound freedom fighters. Ethiopia is in the middle of a whole-ass civil war with their repressive government attempting to exterminate an entire ethnic group. No one said a whole lot about that. The Haitian people, nearly as geographically close to U.S. as Cuba and impoverished by hundreds of years of exploitation and U.S.-backed regime change there, they've been protesting against their now assassinated U.S.-backed authoritarian president for months, and none of y'all said a thing. And frankly, it makes me sick to see the selective weaponization of this humanitarian impulse, to turn it off and on like a spigot in order to justify and serve as cover for actions that, if we're being honest, are really about enriching elites, protecting corporate profits, and fighting for the right to exploit the resources and humanity of every single country on the planet.
That's a point you will never hear on mainstream media and made by, honestly, any U.S. politician. I don't think any U.S. politician will go that far. The idea that this is really about exploitation, corporate profits, resources, and sprinkle in a little bit of geopolitics because obviously anything we could do to blunt the rise of China and the influence of Russia, we do. Because we quite literally, seemingly, have never left the Cold War, even though we should have. But nobody's going to say that. And that's the part that's obvious to anybody who follows this stuff seriously and honestly. It's about exploitation, corporate profits, and resources. And if you don't believe that, she made the case perfectly there. There's been protests going on in Colombia now for months, and U.S. media and U.S. politicians didn't talk about that. Why? Because they're our right-wing government ally. So the protests there don't count. But protests in Cuba, which might nominally just be about, hey, we want more food and we want more medical supplies, that counts as direct calling to overthrow the Cuban government because the Cuban government is our official state enemy. You see how the game is rigged? You see how, like she said, they turn the spigot on and off for their outrage. Hey, if it's our ally, shut up, nothing to see here. If it's our enemy, oh my God, freedom and democracy, that's what we care so deeply about. Our top ally is Saudi Arabia. You're going to tell me we care about freedom and democracy when Saudi Arabia is on speed dial? Again, these are the people, women have no rights. They behead people in the public square for drug smuggling and apostasy and a variety of things that shouldn't even be crimes, adultery. Don't tell me. And again, I mean, you could also make the point on Afghanistan here too, that, oh my God, we're so concerned what if the Taliban takes over. You have religious theocratic law in Saudi Arabia and a lot of our allied countries, and we don't care about it. We don't talk against it. But when it comes to, oh, it's an official enemy, somewhere where we want to occupy, somewhere where we want to exploit, well, then we highlight it because we're just so deeply concerned from a humanitarian perspective. We care about civil liberties and civil rights and things of that nature, which is why the U.S. government routinely takes away people's civil liberties, like how the NSA spies on everybody and we did torture as a matter of routine. I mean, do you see how ridiculous this is at this point? The point that didn't occur to me, which she's so correct about, is really the Colombia point. She's like, there's been protests in Colombia. None of you guys said anything about it. There's been, she talked about what's happening in Ethiopia. Honestly, I'm ashamed to admit, I didn't even know what was happening in Ethiopia, but there was an attempted ethnic cleansing going on there. One that she didn't bring up, which I remember, is the Congo. The Congo's an absolute mess right now. Yemen. Not only is Yemen a mess, we're actively helping the wrong side of that. We're on Saudi Arabia's side as they carry out a genocide in Yemen. It's incredible how we pretend to be these moral, altruistic, benevolent leaders on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're actively on the wrong side of like a genocide. So there are worse humanitarian crises going on. Take Myanmar. or Myanmar, however you say it, with the Rohingya Muslim population. I mean, what's going on there might also be a ethnic cleansing, and we got nothing to say about it. Nothing to say about it. So there is no standard here. There are no principles. There is no genuine concern for human rights. And I'm just amazed at how many people follow them right down the path as if they are concerned about those things. You know? And Greenwald's been making this point the past few days. He's like, well, hold on now. All the people who said they were about America first are like, we should probably intervene and bomb Cuba or invade Cuba and fix Havana. Didn't you guys? I thought you guys said you were America first. We still don't have clean water in Flint, Michigan. Our infrastructure still gets a grade of D+ or C-. And you want to do another invasion and another war? Maybe you're not really America first and you're just a partisan hack. And everybody involved in this is a partisan hack. And that is the reality of it. It's infuriating. I'm going to ask this again. Under what authority would we even attack Cuba? Are we going to pretend like it's part of the war on terror? And by the way, that might be what the Miami mayor wants, because he says, oh, Cuba's doing terrorism and drug trafficking and slavery. He's just pulling stuff out of his ass at this point. Does the Cuban government have internal domestic problems? Of course they do. Are they authoritarian in some respects? Absolutely. We are only responsible for what we do. And we are actively hurting the Cuban people with the embargo. So if you actually wanted to help the Cuban people, lift the embargo. And that's it. We're done. We helped them. Terrorism. They're doing radical Cuban terrorism has targeted Cleveland yet again. What the hell are you talking about? So under what authority? They're not a direct threat to the United States. They're not going to attack anybody here or any Americans. Are you just going to add that on to the war on terror stuff? You're going to pretend like Al-Qaeda is running Cuba? Maybe that is what he wants to do. And has the Middle East taught us nothing? You didn't learn enough from our failure in Iraq and our failure in Libya and our failure in Syria and our failure all throughout Latin America during the Cold War where we were propped up puppet dictators. And by the way, I don't even like talking about these things in the context of like successes and failures, because my issue with it is in the premise. I disagree with the premise that we are the world's police and we should be viewed as the world's police and we have the right to go around and do all these things. If we're the world's police, we're like Alonzo in Training Day, where oftentimes we're the baddies. Because we do the torture, and we do the illegal wars, and we kill innocent civilians, and we don't hold ourselves to the same standards. I mean, look at what we're doing. In Iran, we're sanctioning medicine from getting into the country, and people are dying as a result of it. The International Criminal Court said, you're not allowed to do that. We responded by pulling out of the International Criminal Court and berating it. And we're in any position to pretend like we're a moral arbiter? I mean, look at some of the stuff Brian Kilmeade talked about. We need to bring them freedom and democracy. Imagine being that dumb. You have to be 9 years old to think that we're really fighting for freedom and democracy. I think it was a Democratic representative who said, the White House must move swiftly. As Krystal said, swiftly to what? You want to do a ground invasion? What are you talking about? What do you want to do? This is insanity. Remove the sanctions. That's the only thing we can do to help them. And actually, Krystal makes another good point. Lift the vaccine patent protections. That's the other thing we could definitely do to help them. I mean, if the U.S. wanted to be serious about we care about the world, we want to be the world police, we want to help everybody, we want to be humanitarian, the first thing you would do is lift the vaccine patent protections, because not doing that is effectively genocide. We have the ability to vaccinate most of the world or the entire world in due time, but we're not allowing that because we care more about the profits of Pfizer. And that's not acceptable. Now, Biden said, oh, I'm in favor of lifting the patent protections, but then what happened? Angela Merkel and others were like, we're against it. Now, if Biden cared, he would go out, talk to her privately, and then if she still says no, go after her publicly and try to force all these world leaders, get them on the same page so that we can honestly save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. Millions. But they're not doing that. So spare me this routine of like, we care so deeply. That's why. That's why we say these things and do these things. Our record is so clear. It is clear, but not in the way that they think it is.